Hello everybody, this is Grandmaster Robert Hungaski for chesslecture.com. Today I wanted to talk to you about an opening that I've been working on recently, and it's an opening that doesn't get a lot of press, but that I think is underrated to say the least. And that opening is the Queen's Gambit accepted, which we see after the moves d4, d5, c4, d takes c4. Now what is the main reason that makes this opening so attractive to me is the fact that it's so practical. For so long I got so tired of studying and memorizing openings and variations that I would never get to play. I mean, I was reviewing some of my files from 10 years ago and they've just been gathering dust in my database and I've never used them, and that became frustrating to me because I had spent a lot of time on them. So a few years back, I decided to rework my opening repertoire in a way that would incorporate some very practical openings. That's not to say bad openings, because this is a very reputable opening for black, but certainly not the most topical. Okay, now there are many ways that white can respond to the move d takes c4. Actually, there aren't that many. There's only like 3 good ones and a couple of side choices that are okay. But white's main moves are e3, knight f3, and e4. Today, I wanted to talk about the move e3, which has become sort of the go-to move for white because it's been analyzed in depth in Avrook's books, and a lot of strong players have been playing it. But in order to understand the move e3, first we need to take a little detour and understand why the move knight f3, which at first sight might seem will simply transpose to e3, is taking a back seat. And that is because after knight f6, e3, e6, bishop takes c4, this is the classical way of playing the Queen's Gambit accepted, and white usually has no problem at all playing these kinds of positions. I actually think that these are pretty solid positions for black, and there are no real problems for black. But recently, black has been trying this move bishop g4 with great success. And after the move bishop takes c4, e6, black gets very easy piece play. Black can go knight d7, bishop d6, play very solidly with c6 or maybe c5, and yeah, white has been having some trouble demonstrating that he can get an advantage here. So e3 is quite clever in this regard, because now if we go knight f6, bishop takes c4, bishop g4 makes no sense. Actually, bishop g4 is going to lose a pawn to queen b3, which hits f7 and b7. And if we go e6, well then after knight f3, white has transposed into the classical line of the Queen's Gambit accepted, all the while avoiding the bishop g4 line. So this is a bit of a problem if we play the bishop g4 line. But without the move knight f3, white does lose some control over the center. And that's our cue to strike with this move e5. And that's what I played in the game. So after bishop takes c4, e takes d4, e takes d4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop d6. This is going to be the setup that I will be discussing. There is another option for black here, which is to play with the move bishop e7, so that after castles, we will continue with moves like knight bd7, knight b6, c6, knight bd5, with typical play against the isolated queen pawn. This is a very solid option, and I've tried it as well, and I think a worthy alternative to bishop d6. But let's talk a little bit about bishop d6. After castles, h3. There are several transpositions that are possible here. Usually white will play knight c3, and after knight c6, h3, h6, and that's going to lead to the same position as in the game. But the important thing to remember, if you're playing this position as black, is where your minor pieces are supposed to go. And the trickiest one to remember is that this knight goes to c6. Usually we don't want to put knights in front of pawns, especially if they're on a half open file. Any Sicilian player will tell you that a rook on c8 when there's a knight on c3 is usually quite annoying for white. But this is going to be our setup because we are going to put a lot of pressure on d4. And the other important move, developing move that we want to make is bishop to f5. If we can achieve this development setup with the knight on c6 and bishop on f5, we're going to have lively piece play and a better pawn structure. The game is going to be about balance, but I think black's chances should not be underestimated. So going back to my game, white played h3, h6, knight c3, knight c6, and rook e1. We need to be a little bit careful as black, and I just want to show you one line where we can see black getting into trouble quickly. For example, after knight c3, we could say, oh, well, white hasn't played h3 yet. Sure, f5 looks like a nice square for the bishop, but maybe g4 looks even better. Hitting the knight, putting some indirect pressure on d4. But this would be a serious mistake because after h3, bishop h5, white is going to play g4. And white is not afraid to weaken his kingside like this because after bishop g6, knight e5, white gets tremendous pressure here. And moves like f4 and f5 could be coming, moves like queen f3 or queen b3. This is a very delicate position for black and one that we should try to avoid as much as possible. So after knight c3, black plays knight c6. Now we're definitely threatening bishop g4 because if white answers with h3, we're going to take on f3 and then d4 is going to be hanging. So that's why white does play h3 in this position. And similarly, black wants to avoid this pin, so black plays h6 as well. In the game, the move order was slightly different, but as you'll see, it leads to the same position. h3, h6, knight c3, knight c6. And now white plays the move rook e1. Again, white is always alert to the possibility of playing the move knight to e5. So we need to be careful here and never allow white to play this move under good conditions. So in this position, I played the move rook e8. And this was the first time I had played this line. This game was played in 2016, I believe, which is around the beginning of my interest in this opening. So I had a few things that still needed to be worked out. And this move rook e8 is a fairly inaccurate move. Like I said, the important thing here, especially if this bishop's not coming to g4, is to get it to f5. And I think that instead of rook e8, bishop f5 would have pretty much solved black's opening problems already. Another possibility that white has that's quite interesting here is the move queen to c2. And this is an interesting move, first of all, because if black plays a non-move like a6, then bishop takes h6 is a very nasty surprise, because now white is simply winning. After king h8 takes, and knight g5 is coming, and we're going to get crushed. And there's actually several games in the database, with some strong players even, that went like this, and white won in very few moves. So queen c2 is a tricky move that doesn't simply stop bishop f5. It also threatens bishop takes h6. So in this position, black has to play accurately. And the correct move is knight b4. And this is going to push the queen back to b1. And now we're going to follow up with bishop e6. So that after bishop takes, pawn takes. It's true, we get an isolated pawn on e6, but this is going to be offset by white's isolated pawn on d4. And we're going to have a beautiful blockading square on d5 anyway, and this open file for the rook could give us counterplay. So I think this position is roughly balanced. But this is the only way that white can really prevent the move bishop f5, and it doesn't seem to work after knight b4. Therefore, white chose the move rook e1. And like I said, here I played rook e8, which was not best. Bishop f5 would have been the correct way. But I wanted to show you how things slowly got out of control for me in this game. By the way, it's not like I didn't think of the move bishop f5 during the game, but I saw a ghost. And it's a ghost that you should not be afraid of. And that was the move knight to h4. And if bishop h7, I thought that eventually this queen could come to f3, and this knight could come to f5. I don't know, for example, a move like bishop e3, queen d7, queen f3, I believe. This is the variation that I saw. And I said, this looks kind of sketchy because there's always bishop takes h6 looming in the air. My queen can't really move from d7 because knight f5 is coming, and I thought, well, white's just going to go rook a d1 and slowly increase the pressure. But black has a very active plan here, which is to put a rook on e8 and then play knight to e4. Of course, there's no time for bishop takes h6 because of knight takes d4. That's really the key. And if white plays rook d1 with the idea of playing bishop takes h6, then knight e4 comes in just in time. And this is perfectly fine position for black. So this is why I didn't play bishop f5. It was kind of silly, but live and learn. So the game went rook e8. And after bishop e3, again, bishop f5 would have been better. Instead, I played a6, which is generally a useful move in the setup because when we play bishop f5, queen d7, we always want to be careful that white doesn't play d5, bishop b5, and wins the exchange if our rook and queen are on the same diagonal. So a3, and this was definitely my last chance to play bishop f5. And instead I played this move b5, which is a terrible move. It completely weakens the queen side. It doesn't address the issue of this bishop. This bishop is much better placed on f5 than on b7, for example. So after bishop a2, bishop b7, rook c1, already you can see that eventually black is going to have some problems along the c file. And this is actually exactly what happened. So knight e7, I just figured, okay, I'll put a knight on d5 and I'll have a good position against the isolated queen pawn. But this is just overly optimistic, and the lesson I learned from this game was cannot allow white to play knight e5 so comfortably. Now after knight d5 takes, bishop takes d5, bishop takes, knight takes. And normally if the pawn was on b7, I would say that actually, if the pawn was on b7 and the pawn was on h7, I would say that black would have a very good position against the isolated queen pawn. But here, there are just too many weaknesses in black's position, mainly the c6 square and also the g6 square, because we're not going to be able to kick this knight out of e5 without creating another weakness on g6. So this position, I would say, is definitely better for white, and exactly the kind of position we should be skeptical to enter as black. So queen h5, bishop takes e5, d takes e5. And even though white's position is better, black is still very much in the game. I mean, the knight on d5 is by no means a bad piece. But the move I played here, knight takes e3, is a serious strategic blunder. Here, I should have played something like queen d7 and c6, maybe something like rook e6 and rook e8, try to play f6. and shake up the board a little bit. But after knight takes e3, white has a clear advantage because of this backward pawn on c7. White's pawn structure is much better, and in general, the best piece to take advantage of pawn weaknesses are the rooks. So if you have an isolated pawn, doubled pawns, or backward pawns, you usually want to trade off the rooks as soon as possible. Because if the rooks start piling up on your pawn weaknesses, you're going to be in serious trouble. That's basically what happened to me in this game, and I'll show a couple of more moves, and you can find the rest of the game in the PGN file. But basically, white was able to consolidate his advantage. After the move b4, we see that black is under serious pressure. I mean, the c pawn isn't going anywhere. The rook on c5 is excellently placed, attacking c7, protecting e5. And I slowly but surely got ground out in this position. So like I said, you can find the rest of the game in the PGN file, as well as some of my notes regarding the opening. And now I would like to move on to a more recent game that I played, where I was able to incorporate some of the lessons that I learned from this defeat into a sort of success story. Okay, so we already saw what not to do as black in this variation. Now I wanted to show you a game where I dare say I played the opening pretty well. So let's just recap the initial moves here. D takes e4, e3, e5, takes, bishop d6, knight f3, knight f6, castles, knight c3, knight c6. Like I said, white can play knight c3 first or h3 first. The important thing, this is another nice general principle to keep in mind, is that when white prevents us from playing bishop g4, we should immediately prevent white from playing bishop g5. This is sort of a struggle of pins here. If we can't pin, our opponent shouldn't pin either. And actually, another important variation that we'll talk about later is the move bishop g5, which is going to force black to play very accurately. But okay, in this game, my opponent played the move h3, and now after h6, a3, and bishop f5. So here, I was following the rules that I had laid down for myself, which were against h3, preventing bishop g4, I'm going to play h6, preventing bishop g5. Okay, check that off the list. Now, my next objective in the opening is to put the bishop on f5. And I don't want to delay this any more than I have to. I don't want to play moves like rook e8 or a6 until I've secured the position of my bishop on f5. So now I get to check that off of my list, my checklist as well. Okay, so the game continued rook e1, always a useful move for white. Again, white is looking for any possibility putting the knight on e5. a6, a useful move because the black queen wants to go to d7. But if this queen goes to d7 too soon, I don't think this should be a problem here. But we always need to be on the lookout for what's going to happen if a move like bishop b5 is played. Because now, if knight takes, queen takes, this queen is going to have to go back to c8, and that's just an awkwardly placed queen. So if we have the time, we'll include the move a6 before queen d7. So that's what I did, because I don't think that we're crunched for time here. So my opponent played the move bishop to e3, and now I simply played queen d7. And here, it's an interesting moment in the opening? I would say the opening is just about over, and we're at that fine line where we transition from opening to middle game. And in order to play an opening well, we need to be aware of these transitions and to be aware of some typical patterns that arise in the middle games from the openings that we play. And I would say that after we complete our development, we're in the middle game. So black has completed development, has a good pawn structure, has good king safety. What's the worst that could happen, right? But an important pattern to remember here is that white would like to play queen d2 and bishop takes h6. So for example, if instead of queen d7, black plays a move like rook e8, which looks like a perfectly natural move, this would already be a little bit careless, because it would allow white to play the move queen d2 before we play queen d7. And for example, after queen d2 now, if we go queen d7, bishop takes h6, it's a very powerful move, because after pawn takes, queen takes, white has a tremendous attack with moves like, well, we're threatening queen takes f6, but knight g5 is coming, this bishop on c4 is a monster, maybe queen g5 is also a threat, because you can never go bishop g6 because the bishop's going to be pinned. Bishop takes h6 is a major threat that we always need to be on the lookout for. Now, when we talked about the development of the bishop to f5 in the previous game, we saw that idea with queen c2, which also threatened bishop takes h6. So when we see a move that keeps popping up in an opening, it's a sign that it's an important move and that it's a theme. It's a theme that we need to take into consideration. In this case, it's a very important theme, because if white gets to play it, it's going to be game over. So hopefully, I'm stressing that we need to hurry our development. We need to get this bishop to f5. We need to get this queen to d7. Because otherwise, white will get a powerful initiative. And that's something that we generally do associate with the isolated queen pawn. The isolated queen pawn, of course, is not always a weakness. I happen to think that the isolated queen pawn is more often than not a strength rather than a weakness. So I played the move queen d7, and here my opponent played d5. Now what would happen if he went queen d2 anyway? What's the difference between playing queen d2 now with the queen on d7 or with the rook on e8? Well, the difference is that now it's actually black that has the powerful attack with the move bishop takes h3. And after pawn takes h3, I actually think white's best move would still be bishop takes h6. And against queen g4, queen g5, and this is kind of crazy. I think the computer says here that the best move is bishop takes g2, and after queen g5, queen g4, queen takes g7, take everything, and this is just an equal position. But if white is not expecting this, this could be a nasty surprise. So let's say white captures on h3. Now after queen takes, it's very important that we sacrifice on h3 once the queen came to d2, because now we're threatening to play queen takes f3. And here, almost forced move for white is to go back to d1. And now after knight g4, black gets a very powerful attack. Again, white is forced to make a sequence of only moves here, like bishop to f1, now against bishop h2, king h1, queen h5, and again, king g2, almost only move. And I happen to think that black has tremendous compensation for the piece. He actually already has 2 pawns, so it's not a major material investment. But black is going to continue with moves like rook a8, later play bishop d6, and along the way, white might find a couple of lines that force black to give a perpetual. But overall, I would say that the pressure is on white here. In any case, black is not going to lose this game. So white does need to be a little bit careful as well once we set up this battery of bishop and queen aiming at h3. So my opponent thought for a while here and played the move d5. After knight e5, now bishop to f1. And overall, we're talking about middle game now. I mean, it's really not necessary to memorize any kind of forced moves, but this is a good pawn structure for black. This pawn on d5 is a liability for white. And my opponent was able to find the only sequence of moves that really force black to at least be mindful of what's going on, because there are some threats that we need to be careful with. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about here. After bishop f1, if I play, let's say, the tempting move knight takes f3, then after queen takes f3, I have to be careful that I can't really retreat this bishop, because bishop takes h6 would again pick up a pawn. Fortunately, the bishop's not yet hanging on f5, so I don't have to move it. But it's also not easy to deal with maybe the threat of g4, kicking the bishop out, and then following up with bishop takes h6. In the game, I thought I could go into this line and play bishop e5 here, because then I could simply answer bishop takes h6 with bishop takes c3. And if b takes c3, g takes h6. But here, the move queen takes c3 is very strong. And again, if g takes h6, the knight is hanging. And of course, I can't play knight takes d5 because of checkmate. So actually, bishop e5 doesn't work. So fortunately, I didn't play bishop e5. Instead, I played rook e8. The game went bishop d4. And I had studied a game that went just like this. And it was a game between Jan Timman and Alexander Morozevich. And in this position, after the moves rook takes e1, rook takes e1, rook e8, Timman played the move rook e3. But my opponent here played a novelty. He took on e8. Rook e3 is a move I had spent some time analyzing, because I wanted to make sure I understood what had happened in that game. I mostly analyzed this position not because I was looking at it from a theoretical point of view. I just wanted to go over the game and understand it. I never imagined that someone would actually play this far into what turned out to be my preparation. But the idea that white was going for was that after rook takes e3, f takes e3, again we have some trouble protecting f6. For example, after bishop g6, which is what happened in the game, black simply sacrificed this pawn. And I think this was a great sacrifice that gave black tremendous compensation, because after queen takes f6, Morozevich played queen e8, and a little bit to my surprise, the game just abruptly ended in a draw here. I guess they just agreed to a draw, but I don't think black is worse by any means here. In fact, if anybody's worse, it's probably white. White has some serious dark square weaknesses. This backward pawn on e3 is pretty ugly as well. And this king could run into some trouble if we ever get to play queen e5. Of course, we don't want to trade queens, but even if we did trade queens, I still don't think black is going to lose that endgame. So I guess this didn't really appeal to my opponent. And instead of rook e3, he just took on e8. And after knight takes e8, I was very happy to get my knight out of f6, because now against g4 I can simply, well, of course, knight takes e8 was the only move, but in general, this is a good maneuver to remember, and one that I was able to implement in this game. We're going to block the isolated queen pawn with the knight, Also, get the knight out of f6, which is a vulnerable square, as we've seen. And after the moves g4, bishop g6, bishop d3, takes, takes, I played bishop f8. And here I started to feel like the game was starting to go in my favor. I didn't feel like I was better yet, but I felt like white was going to have to start playing some accurate moves in order to avoid getting a worse position. And as the game went, I think I actually did get an advantage, because white played king g2, b5, and now after b4, this knight has excellent prospects to reach the c4 outpost. So I played knight d6, bishop c5, knight c4, and after trading bishops, I would say that queen and knight, middle game, close to endgame, should be equal. But the way my opponent played knight e4, I think definitely made my position a little bit better after bishop d6, because now it's not going to be so easy for white to trade bishops, at least under good circumstances, because you can always trade, right? With bishop takes d6, but the difference is that now I can always take with a pawn on d6, and this is going to cover the c5 square. It's going to make sure that this d5 pawn doesn't go anywhere, and in the meantime, it definitely seems like my knight is a little bit better than the white knight. In fact, if I was white, I would try to get rid of this knight as quickly as possible. But I could trade knights and I think draw this endgame pretty easily. I could also maybe look at playing knight e5. Definitely a more pleasant position for black. Instead, white made this very risky trade by taking on d6. And after c takes d6, entering a position where I have a tremendous knight, and white has an okay bishop, but generally speaking, queen and knight tend to have greater potential than queen and bishop, especially if the knight has a good outpost. And in this case, not only does the knight have a good outpost that it can hope for, it's actually already there. So the game went bishop e3, queen e7, bishop d4, queen g5, queen e4, queen g6. So my only problem had been my queen, because the white queen on d3 was definitely more active than my queen on d7. So I figured if I can get my queen into the game, then I can start doing some serious damage. And a tool that I used to my advantage was that almost any queen trade is going to lead to a very good endgame for black. In this case, black is probably already winning because I'm going to pick up the a3 pawn and just be up a pawn. So white can't trade queens. That's why he retreated to f3. And here is where I let my advantage slip away, and the game slowly dwindled into a draw. The correct move here would have been to play h5 and start shaking up white's king side a little bit. This is not going to lead to a decisive advantage or anything like that, but I am going to create a potential weakness on g4, and only afterwards will I try to start looking for some queen c2 ideas, maybe start targeting a3 with moves like queen c1. The difference is that after playing queen c2 right away, white plays this move h4. And this is a very good move because now by putting his pawn on h5, white is going to more or less secure the position of his king and also force me to remain vigilant in terms of my king side because I have a lot of pawns on dark squares. So after the moves f6, h5, king f7, king h2, my opponent offered a draw, and I took it. I mean, this was the last round, and I already felt like I didn't play that move h5 and that my advantage had slipped away. So I don't think that black has any realistic winning chances here. So the game was drawn. Hopefully, these two games have given you a basic idea of what black is hoping for in this e5 line against white's third move, e3, where black's pieces should be going, and what threats of white we should be most careful with. This has been Grandmaster Robert Hungaski for chesslecture.com, and I hope to see you soon.